On Saturday, the US and Israel launched obviously a joint attack against Iran. The region is now in a bit of chaos as Iran retaliates against American allies and military assets throughout the Middle East. There are a lot of claims being made right now that the US is fighting this war on behalf of Israel. You say that isn't true. Why do you believe America is fighting this war on behalf of itself?
The basic story is that over the last couple of years, over a few years, but much more intensively over the last 2 years, in all sorts of really important ways, Iran has made itself probably the most important Chinese ally in the Middle East, a choke point, a Chinese capability, essentially, to cut off 25% of the world's oil supply at will if China faces a kinetic threat, for example, from the United States, and the capacity to harass American naval lines in the Indian Ocean, in the Persian Gulf, that it didn't have 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 10 years ago. Iran, facing sanctions, pressured by the United States, pressured by Israel, has increasingly been looking to China as a great ally and strategic depth. That makes sense for any country with adversaries in a region to go to one of the superpowers as backup. But it has served that master, that backup, that patron in ways that have become strategically dangerous to America. So, for example, 5 years ago, Iran was no threat whatsoever to the United States Navy. And this past year, China and Iran have signed agreements that would see Iran receiving from China missiles that can fly at Mach 3, hypersonic missiles that can hit American warships, can disable American warships. Iran's ability to disable American warships at one of the choke points, the Strait of Hormuz, one of the choke points for a quarter of the world's oil, is a strategic act by China. It is a strategic move to seal up, the oil supply to the West. Why is China interested in doing that? Because America has that ability to do that to China in the Straits of Malacca between Malaysia and Indonesia. So China is building through Iran reciprocal strategic capacities. Iran has transformed itself. There's also cyber element to this that's really important. There are many other elements to this. The Iranian oil is sold for very cheap, again, because China is the only customer. And China has used that oil to produce a 1.2 billion barrel strategic oil reserve that is enough to hold China afloat in the case of a massive oil siege by the United States for almost 100 days. In all kinds of ways, Iran has made itself a forward weapon against American power in the Middle East, in a very strategic place in the Middle East. And that is a big part of what this war is about. People say to me, when I published this piece, people said, come on, Donald Trump has this clever strategy against China. Donald Trump doesn't think that smart, right? That's a lot of the comments on social media, on the piece itself. And the simple answer is, first of all, I don't judge or know whether Donald Trump can or can't do. So many people have bet against him and lost. So I don't know that that's a wise way to think about Donald Trump. But there is a well-known and cohesive and deep thinking and very serious and extremely influential group of what are called China hawks. Senator Tom Cotton is one of them. Deeply influential in Congress, deeply influential in the administration and in the Republican Party and generally in the United States, that do think this way a lot, have been doing years of thinking this way. This is one of the pillars of the national security strategy that was published by this administration a few months ago. And absolutely, the fact that Iran has become a major geostrategic energy choke point in the service of China is going to be something on the table when they discuss whether or not they need to go to a war, suddenly a kinetic war in the Middle East against Iran. How could it possibly not be central to what's happening?
Why do you think Secretary of State Marco Rubio hasn't come forward and named that as a direct aim of U.S. military action right now?
The basic story with Marco Rubio is they have all these other reasons. They have, Iran is a threat to us. Iran's an immediate threat to us. It was going to hit us. It was going to attack us. The argument that Iran probably was going to eventually attack American forces or shipping in the Persian Gulf, it's a pretty safe bet because Iran routinely does these things, right? It constantly does. It builds out proxies that attack American interests and American allies. And so that's the argument. Now, that's an easy argument. I think two things. One, if you understand that America sees Iran essentially the way Israel sees Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a second front in the war with Iran. That's why Iran created it, funded it, built it, gave it its arsenal of weapons. Israel had to go to war with Hezbollah to neutralize Hezbollah before it could engage seriously against Iran. Iran has become China's Hezbollah in that sense, or America's Hezbollah. If America has a war in the South China Sea, Iran will open up a front in the Indian Ocean. Iran will spike oil prices in the Persian Gulf. Iran can take out very large American ships with hypersonic Chinese missiles that China has publicly been selling to Iran. That is part of the story. That's part of the grand strategic architecture. You cannot be ready in the South China Sea with aircraft carrier strike groups if you don't have Iran neutralized as a threat to the American supply lines. So that is one thing. Why can't you say it? Because it's incredibly foolish to tell a superpower adversary, this is part of my war against you. If it is at all possible, you give your enemy a way to climb down off the tree. You give your enemy an excuse not to respond. Israel used to carry out strikes in Syria against Iranian targets. Syria understood that Israel wouldn't then announce that they did it. They didn't take credit. As long as Israel didn't take credit, Syria didn't feel obligated to retaliate. Syria really didn't want to retaliate and escalate. You give your enemy the opportunity not to retaliate. That's part of the story here. They don't want to say this is about China because they don't want to have China start planning some kind of a retaliation. Why would you do that? I also think that there are more targets. Venezuela, Iran, and Russia are the three major sanctioned oil sources that China uses to get cheap oil that it absolutely desperately needs. Expect America to turn on Russia next if this China issue is correct, is really the grand strategy as the national security strategy articulates. But also Cuba. You know, Cuba is a Belt and Road member. Cuba has Chinese cyber infrastructure that China uses to spy on the large American command base in Tampa. I suspect that America is going to ratchet up after Iran the pressure on Cuba as well. This is about dismembering that Chinese alliance. They don't want to say it because they don't want Chinese response.
Given Iran's strategic value to China, what do you make of China's lack of appetite to get involved?
This is the fascinating thing. China needs Iran. Not as much as Iran needs China. They're literally their only customer. That oil revenue is something like a quarter of the GDP of Iran. And it's a huge double-digit percentage of the military budget that Iran then has to spend. And so China for Iran is existential. But Iran is also very important to China to allow it to not sink under that bar of the amount of oil it can produce alone. It needs this incoming and especially cheap oil just to keep industrialized, just to keep its factories open. And it won't come to Iran's defense. Now, why won't it come to Iran's defense? Not only won't, it hasn't even pretended to. It issued a statement. I mean, it has been as feckless as, frankly, the British. And it doesn't need to be. The British have no military. China has a vast military. But China doesn't believe it is in any way prepared. Over the last couple of years, this past a few months ago, the Chinese government actually ousted most of the generals of the Chinese high command. There's a lot of turmoil in the Chinese military planning. It's not clear that the planning and the building up of military power is going the way that Xi Jinping wanted. And so China doesn't feel ready to face down the United States. And by forcing the point, by decapitating the Iranian regime, by talking about getting rid of the regime itself, regime change, publicly, Trump talked about it publicly, he made this question of will China come to the defense of countries that signed every deal it asked for. They gave it every platform that replaced their GPS system with the Chinese Beidou system. I mean, just everything China asked for, the repressive technologies, the AIs, scanning image recognition throughout Iranian cities to catch the protesters, that's a Chinese system that it's using Iran as a kind of testing ground for. Iran did everything for China. And China won't come to its defense now because it's simply not prepared to face down the United States. That's an American message. And it's being heard very loudly and clearly in Africa, in Latin America, in Cuba, in Venezuela. And that's part of the story here. They haven't come to Iran's defense. By the way, we should mention another piece to this puzzle, which is Iran signed a defense agreement with Russia. It doesn't have a NATO-style Article 5, you have to come to my defense if I am attacked, but it has everything else. Well, now Iran is facing a serious existential threat, at least to the regime. Russia's nowhere to be found. There are reports that Russian bases in Syria have turned off their transponders so that the Americans or the Israelis don't accidentally bomb them thinking they're connected to the Iranians in any way. Russia has stepped back and run away from this war and done nothing but issue like one or two statements. Russia and China are not allies that you can depend on. This is part of the American message. If this war doesn't go well for Trump, America will still have achieved that message. It has already won, in that sense, the message this was meant to be to other countries thinking that a Chinese integration into China's anti-American alliance system would somehow give them safety or security of any kind.
Why is it important for people to understand that this is not Israel's war?
This is an American war. Israel is doing something very different from dragging America to war. What Israel is doing is providing the cost-lowering local ally that makes a war like this a lot easier to choose to go to, and also a lot less costly, and also a lot more effective. I'll give you an example. If China invades Taiwan, now Xi Jinping has given his military the orders for in a couple of years to be ready for the invasion of Taiwan. So this is not like a crazy idea that maybe China might fulfill this thing that it's been arguing it needs to do for decades. If China invades Taiwan, will the United States come to its defense? Or will the United States allow China to rampage in the Eastern Pacific, in the Western Pacific, and in fact demonstrate that America does not defend, and therefore America will lose its alliance with Japan and South Korea because they're simply not safe with America. So will America come to fight for Taiwan? It might. That president, that administration, whenever it happens, might choose to do so. If they have an Israel-style ally in the region, in other words, willing to absorb damage, willing to deal damage, willing to join America, coordinate with America, take on some of the more sensitive bombing strikes so America doesn't have to do it, so it can have plausible deniability. I don't think Trump is sad that he took out Khamenei, that he killed Khamenei, but nevertheless, it's useful to the Americans that the Israelis actually dropped the bomb. Would Japan serve that function? Would South Korea serve that function? Would Taiwan itself serve that function? If America has those allies, I think it'll be more willing to face down China in that way. That's the function Israel's playing in this war. Israel absolutely wants America to take out that regime. Israel wants to take out that regime itself and is willing to help America. Israel's willing to have its people on the ground in danger, to put its intelligence services on the ground at America's service in this cause. It's willing to be that frontline ally that is so useful and such a force multiplier. But this is nevertheless, for America, an American war. The best way to think about it, and the way that I argued in the piece, was there are two chessboards. There's a regional chessboard that Israel plays on, that Iran plays on, that Saudi plays on. Israel faces Iran. They're fighting. And then there's this much, much larger global chessboard, this contest over 30 years between these two superpowers. This war is taking place in both levels at the same time. It's in a sense two wars in two different strategic environments, and the Israeli and American interests overlap perfectly. And one last point, there will come a point where they no longer overlap. When Trump said regime change, he didn't mean democracy. This isn't George W. Bush. The neocons aren't back in charge, or some cartoonish version of them that people remember. I don't know what, but they're not back in charge. It's not about democracy. I think Trump is thinking Venezuela. He didn't change the regime in Venezuela. He got rid of the one problematic guy at the top. He needs the pieces of the regime that can't work with America, that have become a Chinese forward base. He needs them gone. He needs a regime in Iran. It can still be the IRGC infrastructure, but it has to be Western-oriented, willing to not be anti-American, if not actually pro-American, and no longer in the Chinese orbit. That's what he needs. And if they can provide that, he'll stop the war. And when he stops the war at that point, this very well may still be a regime that still kind of wants to destroy Israel. There will come a moment when America wants to stop the war, and Israel's saying, hey, they're on the run. What are you doing? This is the moment when you, finish them. Finish them is a much more complicated thing that could cause a lot of chaos on the ground that America might not see a way out of. there will come a moment where these two different planes, these two different arenas in which these two actors are acting on, will no longer overlap. And then people will see that there really is an American war for American interest, an Israeli war for Israeli interest. As long as the Venn diagram overlaps, they're going to be shooting the same targets and fighting together alongside each other. But those who say that America would not have gone to this war, except if the Israeli tail wagged the dog, they don't have a lot of respect for America. They don't have a lot of knowledge of the national security strategy published by this administration. They don't appear to know that a lot of the strategic discourse in this administration is about being hawkish to China's efforts to replace the American world order. They don't really seem to grapple with any serious questions of American foreign policy. It's got nothing to do with foreign policy. It is just domestic political prejudices being projected onto the foreign policy stage. Trump does not want the same exact war that Netanyahu wants, but as long as that runway is a shared runway, they're going to be best friends and they're going to go as far as they can go together. And so if you fall for those conspiracy theories, first of all, you'll allow yourself to be an idiot. More importantly, you will not understand what is going to happen next. You will not predict what is going to happen next. You're not going to understand why America is bombing one thing and Israel's bombing a completely different thing. None of it will actually make sense. I'm an Israeli. I really don't give a shit if people hate Jews. Like, I'm the Jews who gave up on other people not hating Jews, like on convincing people not to obsess about Jews. The problem with obsessing about Jews, the problem with thinking that Israel sent America to fight its war in Iran and that this has nothing to do with any of America's national security objectives, is that if you can't understand what's happening because you're too busy in the politics of blame and the politics of conspiracy, then you will no longer be capable to think in terms of accountability, of responsibility, of agency. This is an American politics. On the left, we see it, and on the right, we see it. This is an American politics that are very Middle Eastern politics. One of the reasons Middle Eastern countries, many of them, are so dilapidated, so backwards, so incapable of functioning as coherent, serious, competent countries, is they have these politics in which they're never at fault for anything, so they don't have to fix anything. Other people have done everything to them. Great global conspiracies, often coded Jewish, are keeping them down. And that is a terrible way to run a country that guarantees that your country will decline. That's a terrible thing to do to America. Now, the Jews are not a conspiracy, and Israel didn't drag America into this war with the Epstein files. And if that's true, then thinking it is will make you dumber, and it'll make you less capable of actually understanding and dealing seriously with what's happening on the world stage. I hate to think that America is going in that direction. I hate to think that if you adopt Middle Eastern politics, you'll get Middle Eastern outcomes. That is the opposite of what America has always been.